Good morning, everybody. It's nice to be here, and thank you, Lila, for asking me to talk today about regulating our nervous system and focusing on what matters, and that's the heart. So I'll go ahead and begin now. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera, and I will go ahead and start the webinar now, and I'll pop back in at the end to answer your questions. So welcome, and let's get started. Okay, so nervous system regulation matters of the heart. What I'd like to accomplish today is overviewing the nervous systems that are related to regulating our psychology, our physiology. For many of you attending today, this is going to be a little bit of a review, so I will make swift work of it. But in order for us to talk about the heart and heart rate variability, we really need to set the stage for understanding how our nervous systems interact and communicate with each other and the role that the heart plays in all of that dynamic. Part of that also is going to be talking about the stress response, what chronic stress does to us and how that affects the autonomic nervous system, and then the crash that can occur when we've been chronically stressed for too long. Then I'll go ahead and talk about heart rate variability. What is it? And how it's consonant with nervous system regulation. And we'll end up today actually covering a few techniques that you can start using today or tomorrow if you want for yourselves or your clients. So let's go ahead and get started. So what we have here is the central nervous system. And I'm going to go ahead and pause for 1 second because it looks like I don't have my animations. And I'm going to have to tell this without my animations. So hopefully you can see my mouse as I do this. But we have the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous systems are those that run outside of the body, anything that's not part of the central nervous system. And there's several nervous systems associated with that. It is a communication superhighway where we have these efferent neurons leaving the spinal cord and innervating parts of the body, and afferent neurons that lead up to the spinal cord, communicating from the body to the central nervous system. Now, the efferent neurons are motor neurons, basically the brain telling the body what to do and how to take an action, where the afferent neurons are those that are polymodal, most oftentimes sensory neurons informing the body of what's going on in the brain. There are interneurons here that connect all of the afferent and efferent neurons together, and that allows us for swift communication among the neurons themselves to help transmit that information in addition to connecting them. So the efferent neuron process is top down, where the afferent neuron is bottom up. So what we have here is one of my favorite cartoons of the autonomic nervous system. And I'm definitely an animator person, so we're talking about heart rate variability. What is it? How does it consonant with regulation? And I've already described our central nervous system, which is our brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which are outside of it. So let's just let the animation take over here at this point. Efferent neurons leaving the brain, communicating to the body, which is top down. Afferent neurons, which is the informing the body's information to the brain, which is bottom up. And of course, our friends, the interneurons. So we're really not done with this slide. And so unfortunately, the wrong one was loaded because I'm not done with this picture right now. So let's go back to this and talk about what the thrust of today's webinar is about, which is understanding the autonomic nervous system, which is one of the peripheral nervous systems in the body. Now, the autonomic nervous system, as many of you know, is in charge of regulating much of our physiology, specifically our involuntary organs with the smooth muscle cells and our heart with the cardiac cells. It also controls our blood flow, how the vascular system is constricted or dilated, so information is transmitted throughout the body. And of course, our body energy, which is a lot of what we look at in psychophysiology. Now, there are two branches of the central nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, and this is known as our sympathetic nervous system, which innervates with the spinal cord in the thoracic region of the spine. Its ganglia are connected to this area, and it communicates back and forth from the body to the brain via this region here. The parasympathetic branch is innervated at the cranial and the sacral regions of the spinal cord. Now, the question we want to ask ourselves oftentimes, and this is a kind of a debate now in the literature, and as we are getting to know the function of the autonomic nervous system more and more, is it a distinctly linear system? Is it on a continuum where it functions in opposition with each other, where the parasympathetic is on when the sympathetic is off? Does it work in that antagonistic way? Or perhaps is it more dimensional and dynamic? There are current thinkers like Daniel Quintana, Bernstein, and Smirnov who really are looking at the dimensional nature of our autonomic nervous system and the interplay between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic state. What I'm going to do today is pull into some of that dimensionality as I discuss the flow state of homeostasis and what that really is. So just join me in how I tend to explain this to our clients here, and perhaps it's a way that you could probably adapt as well. As the system is extremely complicated, as we all know. So we're going to talk about body energy, which is one of the most important things that we want to look at when we're talking about the heart. So back to that cartoon I was explaining to you earlier with all the information already plotted on there. But now once I start my presentation, you're going to understand my love of animation, because it really does extend my thought process and helps to make sense of what we're talking about, especially with complicated information like this. So our autonomic nervous system, as we understand, is on this continuum, so to speak, of the parasympathetic, which is characteristic of low energy, a rest, a recovery state of the physiology. And then the sympathetic tone, which is often associated with high energy and an action state. We have this notion of homeostasis, right? And homeostasis really is a state of dynamic energy where we have a lot of the parasympathetic mixed with the sympathetic. So a lot parasympathetic, a little sympathetic is characteristic of homeostasis. So what are some of the characteristics of being in a homeostatic state? In terms of the body, we have a prosodic or rhythmic heart rate. The breath is even and also rhythmic. The blood flow is going throughout the entire body. So the vascular system is open, it's dilated, we're getting plenty of oxygenated blood to go to all of the organ functions and all of the tissues. And in terms of our mind, we tend to be very responsive when we're in a homeostatic state. We're not reactive to things. It's almost like a flow state, if you will. Resiliency in terms of our status, our mental status, is achieved in homeostasis, where we can easily respond to things and bounce back into a state of mindfulness, if so to speak. We're able to take in information in the world. And my two favorite characteristics of the mind are calm and alert when we're in a homeostatic state. Basically, when we achieve homeostasis and we make it our normal state of existence, we tend to live these long, healthy, and happy lives, because we all know the whole purpose of our existence is to survive, but we want to survive as long as we can. We want to survive in good health. We don't want to live a long life where we're ill and in a lot of pain, and also not in a state of suffering. So it really does allow us to live long, healthy, happy life when we maintain homeostasis. Now, some of us in the field realize that homeostasis is not this static state, but as my little diagram shows, it's more of a flow state, where some of us are calling it homeodynamic. And it really is our ability to respond in a flow state to the environment around us. So this is how I like to think of homeostasis, as more of a homeodynamic state. I'm going to be coming back to this slide a couple of times, so keep that in mind as I tell this story. So, stress. We all understand that that beautiful brain of ours, his number one job is to interpret the surrounding environment. And when we interpret issues like threat or demands or urgencies, what happens there is the brain then moves us through to a sympathetic arousal state in our autonomic nervous system. So how does that happen? So basically, when we are perceiving threat, The brain will then turn on the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis, to release hormones into our body. And these hormones primarily are epinephrine and corticosteroid. Those hormones do a couple of things very specifically. They tell the heart to increase, respiration to increase, and then this interesting change in the vascular system takes place, moving us into sympathetic arousal. So what's happening there? Vascular system becomes dilated in the big muscle groups and constricted in the digestive process, starting from mouth all the way down to sphincter. It also constricts blood vessels in the extremities, like hands and feet. The point is to get as much oxygenated blood to the big muscles as quickly as you can, so you can fight what's threatening you, run from it, or freeze and hope to hell doesn't catch you, like a little rabbit might be with an owl, for example. So what are some of the characteristics when we're in a stress response? Well, in the body, obviously, in repeat, we have the fast heart rate, we have rapid breathing, and the hands are not just cold oftentimes, but sometimes they get clammy. So there is a perspiration response that also takes place as part of this fight, flight, freeze, or sympathetic arousal. And so let's think about it. If you are running for your life, for example, if you're a poor zebra running for your life, you're going to need to be perspiring to keep the body cool, expending all of that energy, correct? Another function of the clamminess that some of us notice in our hands especially is vestigial. Many of us have evolved now that we don't even have a galvanic skin response reading when we're stressed, and some of us still do. So it's nothing more than an indicator that we have been triggered by something. It doesn't really serve us a purpose anymore, other than being highly annoying when we want to shake someone's hand. I often tell patients, that's your tell. When your hands are getting cold and clammy, or they're just clammy, stop, take a moment, and understand what just triggered you, because identifying stress is part of our recovery from it. Muscle tightness is also a characteristic of the stress response, as is restricted digestion. Because let's think about it. If I am running for my life from a pack of, I don't know, coyote, let's say, I don't really need to be using all of my body energy to be digesting my breakfast. That energy is best used to go to those big muscle groups so I can get away from the coyotes and not become their breakfast. I can get back to the act of digestion after I'm safe. So some of these are the characteristics that happens when we're in a stress reaction. In terms of the mind, these are panic symptoms. They're also symptoms of anger. Anger is the fight piece of the fight, flight, freeze. We also become very impulsive, usually in a stress response. Going back to my coyote example, a lot of the brain energy that's used to keep us in an executive functioning ability, where a lot of the energy is in the frontal lobe, so we can communicate and plan for the future and control our impulses and be all of those things that are human. A lot of that energy is pulled away from the frontal lobes and moved into the limbic structure so we can get the body out of harm's way. And impulsivity is one of those characteristics, because if I see a pack of coyotes running my way, I am not going to expend energy to analyze and think if I can jump over the wall. By the time I'm doing all of that, I'm already dead, right? So I need to just be impulsive and just throw myself to the wall and hope to God that I can actually climb it. So there's an impulsive characteristic to when we're in a stress response. And high anxiety is also related to when we're stressed. So when the brain then perceives that the threat, the urgency is gone, we can move out of a sympathetic state into recovery mode. And this is done by the relaxation response, which is the parasympathetic tone being turned back on, putting the brakes on the sympathetic and pulling us back into a state of our homeostasis. So then we go back into this rhythmic state, this flow state of homeodynamic. However, my friends, what happens when those demands are chronic? Our life is filled with expectation and deadlines. When we're filled with uncertainty, just like COVID did for us for the past couple of years, then we're starting to worry a lot. Some of us may have job losses. This is more of a modern creation of stress that us humans are particularly accustomed to, unfortunately. Some of us are admired for living in this state where we're constantly on with a lot of press, but this is not what we call a homeostatic state, but more of a state of chronic stress where we have a lot of the sympathetic tone and just a little bit of the sympathetic tone. Chronic stress is really a phenomenon experienced by people. We don't see it in the Serengeti with the wild animals as they go through their life of being on sympathetic arousal and being homeostatic, but this is a creation of our modern lifestyle where there are so many presses on us. So what are some of the characteristics when we are in this chronic stress where we have a lot of the sympathetic arousal, just a little of the parasympathetic? In the body, we have been known that chronic stress illnesses are related to high blood pressure, hypertension. Believe it or not, our immune system becomes suppressed because those cortisol, stress hormones and corticosteroids, when they become washed in our system, we're living in the miasma of cortisol, it starts to break down our natural immune response. It also affects our vascular system. Recall how I said that we have this constriction and dilation process when we're in a stress reaction. Well, guess what? Headache, migraine, Raynaud's are all associated to those vascular changes that are sort of stuck in hyperdrive. That goes to say that with muscle tension as well. Next time you are stressed out, ask yourself, where are your shoulders? Are they up around your ears? Are you clenching your teeth? Are you clenching your fist? Are you clenching your sphincter? A lot of these muscle tension takes place that we're bracing when we're in a chronic stress state. And lastly, but GI issues are also an issue when we're in chronic stress, because remember, we don't have a lot of blood flow going to the gut when we're stressed out. And so it's not uncommon to have ulcers, IBS, acid reflux, these sorts of things as a result of being in a chronic stress state. The heart rate is not prosodic when we're chronically stressed, it's attenuated. And I will get back to what this means in a little bit. In terms of our mind, we tend to be impatient, we're intolerant, there are feelings of irritability, anxiety, and agitation. So these are some of the psychosocial, psychological characteristics of chronic stress. So Hans Selye in the 50s called chronic stress the stage of resistance. And what he found in his studies with rats is if the animal could not get out of a stage of resistance, the body would flip a switch and thrust it into a state of exhaustion or crash that he calls it. And this really is overactive parasympathetic tone, which we see takes place when we need recovery from too much stress. So what does it mean to be in an overactive parasympathetic tone? What this looks like is exhaustion, fatigue, a feeling of burnout. And in fact, in 2019, the World Health Organization actually coined a term called burnout syndrome that is related to people when they are working too hard for too long. And related to your job is a sense of exhaustion. Another criteria to meet for burnout syndrome is a sense of cynicism or negativism, especially towards your job. And the third criteria for burnout syndrome is that you're just not as productive. Your productivity, your efficacy has been reduced. In terms of our mind, we feel low motivated, we feel apathetic, and we're depressed. So how do we get back into this state of flow, the state of homeodynamic? And we do that by tapping into two major organs of the autonomic nervous system, our heart and our lungs. So that's our quick little review of the nervous systems. And now we're going to talk about heart rate variability. What is it and how is it consonant with regulation? So we have known since ancient Greeks how to read a pulse, right? And so the heart rate really is a pulse, and the pulse is the number of times your heart beats per minute. It can also be considered the speed of your heartbeat measured by the number of contractions of your heart per minute. Now, it was in the early 19th century that Carl Ludwig was a physiologist, and he stumbled upon something called the respiratory sinus arrhythmia. And other physiologists had been talking about it But what Carl Ludwig did is he actually developed something called the kymograph, which allowed us to note how the heart itself changed its speeds based on the nature of our breathing. And that's what we call the respiratory sinus arrhythmia. Now, it wasn't until about 50 years after Carl Ludwig's work that we were able to appreciate heart rate variability. And that was done basically by the invention of the EKG, or the electrocardiogram, which was developed in 1895. Now, this tool, and then after which where we were using other digital sound signal processing tools, especially during the late 60s, allowed us to appreciate heart rate variability. And it allowed us to move away from just identifying a pulse to being able to measure the pulse over time based on recordings for 5 minutes or 24 hours, that sort of thing. So we understand heart rate variability to be the beat-to-beat change in our heart rhythm. Some of us call it the beat-to-beat interval. And a lot of those in the actual research area of heart rate variability call it the R-to-R variability, which is based on the QRS complex of the actual pulse. And what that basically means is we are measuring the R waves and the distance in between them. So the R wave is the larger oscillation in the pulse that is then measured in heart rate variability and the space and time in between those big pulses. So another example on this EKG is a smaller R-to-R variability. As you can see that the distance here is a lot smaller than there. So with our frequency domain techniques today and with signal processing, we can then take these EKGs and then plot them on a graph to actually understand the rhythm of the heart itself. So for example, taking a series of these fast R-to-R intervals are indications of the heart speeding up, whereas these slower waves here are indications of the heart slowing down. So when we use this clinically, and that's how I'm going to talk about it today, what we're interested in is what is the lowest heart rate itself compared in terms of distance to the fastest heart rate. So a lot of us call this the peak to trough in heart rate variability. So for example, this is somebody with a heart rate of 60 beats a minute around here, and right about here is looking at about, I don't know, about 83 beats a minute. So this distance is what we're interested in to understand the difference between a high HRV and someone with a low HRV. So high HRV is correlated to someone with cardiovascular fitness, overall good health, physiological resiliency, and good mental performance. People with good and high HRV also have good stress management. So these are people who really are in a good health shape. A lot of HRV or heart rate variability study is done with optimal sports performance, as it is done for cardiovascular health, but we're using it as part of psychophysiology today, and we're seeing that it's not just a physiological state of health, but also a mental and focused state of health as well. Now let's talk a little bit about low HRV, and that's when the heart is not swinging in terms of big peak and trough relationships, which we would call an attenuated rhythm. Now, there's been plenty of research, and you can just jump online now and go to your library, and you will find rows of articles that talk about the effects of low HRV. Some of them are chronic pain is associated with low HRV, cardiovascular illness and early mortality due to cardiac illness is correlated to low HRV. So is diabetes. And in terms of psychophysiology, anxiety, PTSD, and depression are also related to those with low heart rate variability. Those with low heart rate variability do a poor job of regulating their emotions. Our friends at HeartMath have done some work over the years where they've asked patients who have been attached to EKGs or photoplethysmographs to capture heart rate variability patterning to sit in states of coherence, conjuring up positive emotions, gratitude, appreciation. And what they were able to notice is that the behavior of the heart looks sinusoidal as this one does. This beautiful sine waves that's correlated with high HRV. Likewise, patients and subjects have been asked and encouraged to be in a state of frustration, anxiety, or irritation, and what they're able to capture is a heart rate variability pattern that does not look anything like this coherent pattern, but that's more scattered and attenuated at times. So it's really very interesting work as we're starting to see the correlates between these two. So how do we get ourselves back into this homeodynamic state, and how does heart rate variability relate to this flow? So allow me to talk about, once again, the characteristics of homeostasis. Remember, I said it was a prosodic heart rate and even breathing, right? So what does that look like in terms of consonance with regulation? So let's start with the lungs. This is the one organ in our autonomic nervous system we can actually control if we want to. Thank God we don't always have to control the lungs, because how would it be like to go to sleep at night and have to worry about breathing, right? So, but if we want, we can tap into our lungs whenever we're consciously aware. We can hold our breath, we can breathe rapidly, we can breathe deeply, or we can just forget about it and let our bodies breathe themselves. So this is what we know about respiration and the autonomic nervous system. So if I am going to do the act of inhalation, followed by the act of exhalation, believe it or not, we now know that the inhaling or the inhalation of the lungs is correlated to a sympathetic tone in the autonomic nervous system. Likewise, the exhalation act is related to parasympathetic nervous system. Now, if I am going to follow this rhythm of breathing over and over again, it's going to impact my heart. So as I breathe in and out, and in and out, and I do this repeatedly, we know based on respiratory sinus arrhythmia that the heart will take the shape of the rhythm of the respiration. So over time, these breaths per minute actually become or look like our beats per minute, if that makes sense. So what we're looking at here is something in HRV biofeedback called resonance frequency. By breathing in this flow state, we are literally exercising our baroflex receptor, which creates a coherence between heart and breath. So it looks a little like this. As I'm breathing in and I'm breathing out, I'm moving the body in from a sympathetic tone to a parasympathetic tone, a sympathetic tone to a parasympathetic tone, because the heart and lung are innervated by both branches of the autonomic nervous system. So think about the dance of sympathetic tone, parasympathetic tone, sympathetic tone, parasympathetic tone. That's the homeodynamic state. And hopefully, by repeating this, I've come full circle to make that point on how clear that is. So what's happening there? So we have this heart-brain connection, right? And so when our hearts, our autonomic nervous system, and the afferent neurons from our heart are going up the vagus to communicate the brain, we call this the heart-brain connection. And so when this is taking place, that innervation process attaches itself to the medulla first, which we all know regulates our blood pressure, and it is also in control of regulating our autonomic nervous system. The vagal nerve from the information from the heart also then goes to our amygdala, as many of us know is responsible for emotional memory, among other things, which then can help regulate our emotional state. Furthermore, up the chain is stimulating the prefrontal cortex, and that information can affect our mental performance, can affect our focus, and can affect our executive functioning. We do a combination of neurofeedback and biofeedback here at Sierra Tucson, and I'm never surprised to see when we do heart rate variability training, we see improvements of the sensory motor rhythm in the parietal cortex of the brain, which is which a lot of us will call the CZ, the central part of the brain or the crown. And we see improvements of regulation of brainwave frequency just by virtue of doing heart rate variability. And here's another fun fact for today. This vagus nerve that I love so much, believe it or not, there are 80% more afferent neurons running up the chain of the vagus nerve and only 20% flowing down from the brain to the heart. And it always makes me wonder who's really in charge if you think about it. The heart is giving the brain way more information than the brain is giving the heart. So something to think about, maybe have a conversation over dinner about. But I just think it's fascinating. And this is still such new work that we're uncovering so much of this. So how can we measure this, and how do we know the state of the autonomic nervous system through understanding heart rate? So there are a couple of frequency domain and time domain analyses that a lot of researchers use, and we also use in heart rate variability biofeedback. I'm going to go over this very, very briefly because this is very advanced calculus. It's physics, basically math. And so what we do is by understanding the virtue, the rhythm of the heart that it takes when it's beating, this up and down synergy that it takes, we can actually plot over time something called heart rate variability analyses or a power spectrum. And so what this has done, especially with cardiac and sports performance research, is they will slap on an EKG or some form of photoplethysmograph to measure this in a 24-hour period. For the purpose of HRV biofeedback, we might do this for a 5-minute period with our equipment. So what does this mess tell us, right? So it tells us a few things from our understanding. So this VLF stands for very low frequency band. And when we see the amount of activation in here, this gives us a sense of how much of the individual is in a sympathetically aroused state. So the VLF, or very low frequency band, is modulated, is believed to be modulated by sympathetic activation, whether it's emotional stress or could be physical activity. The low frequency band speaks to what I said earlier about homeostasis being this beautiful blend, this Goldilocks of just enough parasympathetic tone and a little bit of sympathetic tone. And the low frequency band is this sort of barrelflex activity of regulation of homeostasis. And finally, the high frequency band is associated with the parasympathetic activation, which is modulated by it in association with deep relaxation, recovery states, or even when we're sleeping. So we'll see a lot more of this elevated during sleep. A little bit of an interesting thing is when we do our own HRV analysis with a lot of our patients, oftentimes we may see a lot of activation after a 15-minute stress evaluation that we give them. And so when we go over the findings with these individuals, I'll often say, it's like, are you here because of depression, or are you feeling any burnout in your life, a lot of fatigue? And 99% of the time they're like, absolutely. That's why I'm here. I'm depleted. I'm exhausted. And we can actually see that reflected in the 15-minute heart rate variability analysis. So even though this is still new science and it's really used a lot in bigger research programs, we can start to use some of this clinically to help our patients re-regulate. So let's talk about what it means to use some techniques towards that regulation. And so a little bit of a gift for me, for you today, to think about it and to use it not just for yourself, but for perhaps your clients. So one of the things that we talk about when we have a lot of chronic stress is this shift over into the stuck state of too much sympathetic tone to just a little bit of the parasympathetic tone. So there's a technique that I like to use, and I explain to patients that when you do this technique, it slowly but surely moves your body out very gently from this high aroused state into more of a flow state. So bringing us into homeodynamics. So how do we do that? So first of all, what we want to do is talk about the technique of actually breathing and tapping into the respiratory system. And please note, what we want to do is use that diaphragm, but we don't want to use the diaphragm all big and pressured like. We want to use the diaphragm when we're breathing in a gentle yet full state. So oftentimes what I'll do is I'll have folks put their one hand on their heart, one hand on the diaphragm, and I'll encourage them to keep the intercostal chest from moving up and down, and actually have them intentionally stretch the diaphragm out when they're breathing in and pull the diaphragm in when they're breathing out, explaining that the diaphragm is actually needed for relaxation breathing. And I always tell people, when you look at a newborn, what do you notice when they're breathing? You know, they're belly breathers by nature. They're born perfect. And we screw that up with stress and trauma as we get old, and we become more chest breathers using clavicular breathing, which we refer to the intercostal muscles. And those innervate up the vagus nerve, communicating to the brain that there's stress. So we need to calm that area down and start using the diaphragm in a very gentle yet full manner. When we do breathing techniques, we also want to breathe gently in through the nose. And if we're new at breathing techniques, we want to gently push the air out through pursed lips, especially when you're doing a technique that's a longer exhale. You need to be able to control that outflow. Again, the exhale should not be pressured, but very, very gentle. You don't want to blow out the birthday candles with this breath, okay? When we do technique, I usually tell folks no more than 2 minutes, because you can start to get a little dizzy with the exchange of CO2 and oxygen. So it's important to just do it for brief periods of time. Now, breath work to help elicit the relaxation technique, one of my favorites is called the breathing warm-up. It's basically a 1-to-2 ratio breath. What that means is whatever you breathe in, inhalation, you double count in an exhalation. So breathing in for 3 seconds, exhaling in 6, breathing in for 3, exhaling for 6. Do that for about 2 minutes. That's usually about 8 of those. Or if you have a bigger expanse of the diaphragm, you can breathe in for 4 and exhaling in 8. You would probably only want to do about 6 of those, right? So this is one way to help elicit relaxation response in the autonomic nervous system. And so how does that work? Let's return back to our diagram here. When I am breathing in for 3 seconds and slowly exhaling in 6 seconds, what I'm basically doing is spending about 3 seconds stimulating that sympathetic tone and twice the time stimulating the parasympathetic. Does that make sense? I think it should. Likewise, when you do a technique, you can guarantee that your heart will follow along and become coherent, thereby pulling us out of that stressed state little by little. Sometimes, if you'd like, you can count the breaths like I did now. So you can be thinking, inhaling for 3, exhaling for 6, and you count those in second paces. Or sometimes what can be really beneficial is pairing the breath with intention. And we can do this by saying a mantra during an inhalation and following another mantra with exhalation. So if you want to count, you can count, or you can count in 3 seconds, inhaling the words may I be, and then exhaling with filled with letting go, or filled with abundance. May I be filled with grace or gratitude. We do know from some research that when we have a state of consciousness, when we're focusing on what makes us happy, states of appreciation, especially some of the work that comes out of HeartMath, the physiology actually can move into homeostasis a lot easier, likely due to some of the release of oxytocin rather than corticosteroids from the brain when we move into a state of appreciation and gratitude. So it looks a little like this. May I be, and then filled with whatever you want to say. So hopefully this little example could be beneficial to you, that you can use with your clients. And I definitely encourage you to go ahead and to explore the internet with studies on HRV analyses and HRV biofeedback, and also with some breathing techniques that come from our understanding of how becoming coherent with the respiration can actually elicit regulation into the physiology overall. And so with that, I want to say thank you, which leaves us with some time to answer a few questions. And so what I'll do here is I will open up my question box if I can find it. Here it is. And see if there's any questions that I can answer. And I will also bring my face back to share my lovely face with all of you. All right, so I'm going to see what we've got here in terms of questions. What can I do to get out of the exhausted state? Can you recommend biofeedback facilitators in Scottsdale? Absolutely. One of the things I can do at the end of this conversation today is I'm going to be sending out an email to all of you, thanking you for participating, and a couple of takeaways from the lecture itself. But you'll get my email. So what I want you to do is email me back directly, and I can get you a list of providers. But if you have pen and paper handy right now, what you can do is go to www.bcia.org, which is the Biofeedback Certification Alliance of the United States and actually the world. They have a facilitator locator of people who have been certified, trained in biofeedback, in neurofeedback, and one of our new certificates is in HRV biofeedback. So put in your zip code and you can find a practitioner who's been certified in your area. So that's a good question. But to get yourself out of the parasympathetic is going to be basically the same thing we talked about getting yourself out of a chronic stress state, is by using breath work. And then sometimes the breath holding techniques can actually innervate a little bit more energy, because when we're holding our breath, we're actually creating more of a sympathetic arousal. So keep that in mind as well. Do you complete HRV assessments and evaluations on all of your trauma patients? I love the heart math tools. I love heart math too. There are other products as well that are very, very good at heart rate variability biofeedback. The BioTrace that comes out of the Netherlands and the Thought Technology that comes out of Canada also has heart rate variability in it, as well as the heart math. The heart math is dedicated to heart rate variability training, and they also have their own certification programs as well. All right. So there's so many questions coming. They're just sort of popping through here. Are there certain, it's popping up so quickly. Let me see if I can stretch that up, Lila. All right, here we go. Now I can read it better. Does the research support that trauma tends to leave people with a higher set point for adrenal response? And if so, can this be changed over time? That's a really good question. So as we know, the adrenals are responsible for the release of our stress hormones of the pituitary adrenal cortex. And you know what happens is that we can see something called adrenal fatigue as a result of chronic stress over time. This is a question I would definitely want to take to a naturopathic physician to talk about doing sort of recovery and restoration healing with somebody who's been in a chronic stress state. So like oxidative stress and adrenal fatigue are outputs of chronic stress and can be very debilitating to one's physiology. And what I want to say to you who's asked this question, because it's a really smart one, is that I would think with practice of heart rate variability over time, if you were to do it several times a day, every day, and removed those chronic stressors in your life, you could probably see an improvement to overall physiology. But the research is not probably out on that yet because we're just so new in appreciating heart rate variability. But with proper care, nutrition, and let me tell you this, sleep, that is going to be one of the most important things that you could probably do to help regain a physiology of health. Is there research on the correlation between ACEs and HRV? It's a really good that you should bring this up. There's a gentleman by the name of McCready who's part of HeartMath, and I've actually been able to observe a few videos online done by some legitimate stress physiology practitioners, and they actually talk about the correlation between childhood experiences, ACE or adverse childhood experience, and those people who are primed to feel more chronic stress or be more fragile as a result of chronic stress. Again, this is new research, it's all correlative, but what we found is that when people have high ACEs, they come from a childhood of chronic adversity, whether it's familial issues, societal issues, direct exposure to trauma, or indirect. Kids are observing violence in their homes or mistreatment. And it can really set the stage for somebody to have a physiology that is braced, not just in terms of the autonomic nervous system, but also in terms of the central nervous system. Because remember, the goal is to live a long, healthy, happy life. So when our systems are dysregulated, it's not because we're bad people, it's because our nervous systems are trying its best to keep us alive. And so these stressed states of brain and body are really there to keep us in a protective, hypervigilant, hyper-aroused, braced state, because we're always waiting for that other shoe to drop. So it's a very complicated process of healing, right? Because we move into the world with these skills of pushing through and bracing, and then what happens is we may, as adults, start to have issues with using alcohol or drugs to help regulate our system, in addition to behaviors like isolation or irritability to help manage that as well. So we see a lot of that here. It's here at Tucson, and you know what? The process of healing is not just by plugging into HRV, which is going to help, absolutely, but it's getting the psychiatric care, getting the naturopathic care, getting ourselves out and exercising again, and building, cardiovascular function and sleep. So there's so many pieces to helping recover from chronic stress as a result of a childhood adverse situation. So there is some research to show that ACEs are related to chronic stress issues for adults as well. So really excellent question. And I think as providers, we need to really plug into the integrative care of what we do to help individuals heal from that, and to understand safety is safety and not anticipatory shit going to hit the fan, so to speak. There's another question here that I think is a really good one. And is HRV the same thing as coherence? And the answer is no. So HRV analysis is really part of big studies now, as we also are using it for heart rate variability biofeedback. But HRV is really more interested in the swing of the heart rate, right? It is the distance of the heart rate from beating slow to beating fast, beating slow to beating fast, where coherence is about the pattern and the rhythmicity. So that's a really good question. I like that one. Can you review the afferent and versus the efferent? Yeah, okay, so afferent, once again, is the nervous system of the autonomic nervous system and the other nervous systems communicating. These are sensory polymodal nerves going up the spinal cord, communicating to the brain. And efferent is the brain coming down and communicating through motor neurons to the body to take action. All right, I will have time for, is there benefit to holding the breath in between in and out? So I'll go ahead and answer that question. And it was related to the one that I had mentioned with the other person about fatigue. And what we're looking at here is the holding of the breath can actually stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. Think about your patients who brace, or you notice that they don't breathe, right? That's a bracing nature, which is part of the freeze response. And so when we have folks who are fatigued a lot, really just a lot of chronic fatigue or low energy, the holding can actually be beneficial to sort of stimulate the nervous system. Some people call it box breathing, when you breathe in for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, and hold again for 4. You can moderate that to 3s and 2s, depending on what an individual's capacity is. So holding can actually help stimulate energy. But No more than 2 minutes at a time, because you will get dizzy. So then it's not going to help you. Okay. Need a visual for stretching the diaphragm. Well, you got me. Okay, so I'm getting a little blurry here with this camera. So the diaphragm, you could use a balloon, right? So we expand the diaphragm out when breathing in. Think about it. It's down here. And so when that diaphragm opens up, and it's not just out this way, it's actually out to the side, it allows the lungs to fill up with a lot of oxygenated air. Likewise, when you're squeezing that diaphragm in, so think of a balloon deflating, it's going to help push air out of the lungs. So there are some apps that will have these mantras moving back and forth. One of my favorite biofeedback games is the breathing tree. And the tree expands with the breath in and expands with the breath out, deflates with the breath out. Can be really, really beneficial. All right. And I think we have time for one more. Lots of compliments, really great presentation. Thank you. Well, thank you for joining me. I love talking about this stuff. Let's see what was got there. I use a free heart rate monitor on my phone with clients as a simple biofeedback tool. You put your finger over the light on the smartphone and it measures heart rate. Yes, there are quite a few biorhythmic devices you can use now. I know Garmin is actually working with some of the big universities to use your smart, I forgot what those are called, but anyways, sort of your pacer bracelets that people can use can actually measure heart rate variability. There are rings, so anywhere where you can get a pulse and that there is a field where you can have the reading the blood pulse from the fingertips. So putting your finger on top of a camera lens on an app can do the same thing because it's it's looking at the infrared technology. So you really want to be able to do that. It depends on your skin color as well. The darker you are, the harder those things are to read that. And they can give you a pretty simple version of heart rate variability if the app is able to translate it into those spectral displays like I showed you earlier. Sometimes they'll come out and give you a number. There are a couple of heart rate variability programs that give you numbers when you're in homeostasis or when you're in stress response. And I believe those are proprietary numbers. I've really tried to figure out how they create those numbers, and I'm not able to actually find any literature that tells me how they do that. So what we like to do is use the spectral display like I had shown you with the very low frequency, the low frequency, and the high frequency to give us a sense of where the heart is at. And not all biofeedback programs are going to provide that information. So I want to thank you all so much for participating with me today. If you have any further questions after I send you my thank you email, send them my way. I love talking about this, and we all work together to help our patients get better lives, to be more regulated, and to lead those long, healthy, happy lives that are so important to us. And so for that, I want to thank you and have a great day. Thank you for joining us.